President Dwight Eisenhower. Birthplace: 609 South Lamar Avenue, Denison, Texas. Story told by historian retired school teacher Maxine Mineon.
I'll be telling you what brought them here, why he worked there, and eventually what took them back. Texas is a hub. It just caused this area to explode. In the first 100 days, population jumped to 3,000. So it brought commerce and business, pardon me, and it brought people. And it brought the Eisenhower mother and father right here to this little house.
Where they came from?
They came from Kansas.
Okay.
Came from Abilene, Kansas. Hope, Kansas, actually, at that point in time. The actual situation was that David, the father, worked for the Katy Railroad. I'll be telling you what brought them here, why he worked there, and eventually what took them back. But he worked for the Katy Railroad. Now, as to where he worked, you see that last clump of trees over there? Just beyond that, today, there is an overpass.
Okay.
Right by Albertsons. Just where that overpass is located is where the roundhouse was located. David, the father, worked as a manual labor at the roundhouse. They would bring train engines in. He had to put them on a turnstile, turn them around. He had to go in and wipe down hot, dirty, greasy engines and relubricate them.
Sure.
The man worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, no fringe benefits, and he made under $40 a month.
Right.
Which even then put this little family right at the poverty level, income level. Now at the same time, do you see where these tracks are placed right here? Just where we have placed these tracks, if you lean down and look to the right, you'll see like a tunnel going back into those trees. So I wanted you to be right here where you could see this. A corridor of the train, when they lived here, came through that area, ran just where these tracks are, and it went east. And if you look there to the left, you'll see the remnants of an old water tower standing in the concrete middle of those trees. And notice how concave the land is on the other side. That's where the tracks ran. Train went east to Mineola, Texas. And when they lived here in this little house, when the president was born, 15 to 20 trains a day were going up and down this train. This is literally in their yard. Now, vibration alone would have shook this little house every time they went by. And if that weren't enough, these trains are fueled by coal. So we're going to have this black soot, smoke, congested air coming out. The little house is 141 years old this year. But when they lived here, it didn't look like this. The men worked very hard to preserve it because being a wood structure in this climate, it would have deteriorated years ago without that care. But when they lived here, this little house, every house up and down through this neighborhood, because this was a working class, low to low middle class neighborhood. And every house in this area was covered with that black soot. The houses were about the color of the bark of those trees over there, dingy. If that weren't enough, this is before electricity, so there's no air conditioning, there's no fans of any kind, and we know how miserably hot it can be here in July and August. To have had air to circulate, Ida, the mother, would have opened the front door, the back door, she would have opened those windows to get air to circulate. And when she did, notice there are no screens on the window. They didn't have them. I said, that tells me two things that she would have had to deal with. Black smoke would have gone right into that house from all of this train activity, right along with flying insects. Now, I tell you that to give you some idea of the level of difficulty life was on a daily basis for that little family. You know, we're so privileged. We push buttons and flip switches and we're cool and comfortable. But that was a far cry from what Dwight Eisenhower's world was when he was born into it. Now we're going into the house and we're going to go into history. I'm going to let you folks come right up here because normally I'd walk two little rooms in this little home that I never come into without really feeling it. And this is one of them. It was on the night of October the 14th, 1890. 128 years ago this year that President Dwight David Eisenhower was born. He was born and they did not have a baby bed, crib, or a cradle for that little baby. That's why you don't see one depicted here. The mother and father literally took a drawer from a chest of drawers like the one you see here, took it out, emptied it out, put a blanket in it, probably secured it on a chair or an ottoman for safety's sake, and that was President Eisenhower's baby bed. So when I say he comes from a humble beginning, indeed he did. No electricity, she would have had a kerosene lamp lit like the one you see right there on the table. No indoor plumbing, no bathrooms, of course. Every drop of water, eating, drinking, washing, cooking, or cleaning, Ida had to draw it from a well, and I'll show you where the well was. No closet in this room. They had a little wardrobe unit, something like the one you see there. Ida might have had 4 or 5 dresses like the one on the bed. And David probably had 2 or 3 sets of work clothes, which would have been overalls or coveralls, and he wore a railroad cap like the one you see hanging there. Those would have been washed once a week because washing was a terrific, heavy, burdensome task. Now the closest thing we have that Ida had with her is that sewing machine right there to your right. That is an 1890s treadle machine, and she had one just like it. She brought it with her and took it back. If you go to the presidential site, library, museum, and home place where they returned and where he lived in Kansas, you'll see the twin to that machine sitting right there in the bedroom. She sewed. She made her clothes, children's clothing, anything that had to be sewn up. That lady had to know how to do it. Now, as we go through the little house, you're going to notice the wallpaper and the paint, and you'll find yourself thinking, my goodness, it looks new. Well, it is.
Pretty new.
Because after 141 years, things have to be refurbished along the way. We are under the auspices of the Texas State Historical Commission, pardon me, and they have an archivist in Austin who is in contact with a vintage wallpaper manufacturer. Every pattern, every color that you see throughout the house, you could have gone into a little home in 1890 and seen papers like that. So if you come across, we'll cut it. Today we have family rooms and we have living rooms. And I live in here, people keep bringing up the great room, like the Buckingham Palace. They had the parlor, and this is where they would have had visitors sit and talk, read. It was lit by a kerosene lamp. Kerosene was the light for the day. Heated, we think, by probably a little pot-bellied cast iron coal-burning stove, because coal was the fuel for cooking and for heating. Now, a little bit about David and Ida, the mother and father, because the more you understand about the qualities and the characteristics of these people, the more you understand Mr. Eisenhower and his upbringing. You see the qualities that made this man the strong man that he was, and indeed he was. Ida and David Eisenhower. Her name, maiden name, Stover. Ida Stover Eisenhower. Ida was originally from Virginia. She was the youngest of 8 children. And when she was 4.5 years age, she was the only girl in that family, all brothers. When she was 4.5 years of age, her mother died. And then when she was 11, her father died. So that little girl was orphaned at an early age. She then had to go and live with relatives. For a while, a grandmother, and then from there she lived with an aunt and her family. So the little thing was pulled kind of from home to home. A most unusual young woman in her time. The more I read of her, know of her, the higher she goes in my esteem, and she's way up there. This is a little orphan girl growing up in the 1870s. And women in the 1870s weren't encouraged nor expected to be well educated. If she could read, write, basic math, and good domestic skills, that's what was expected of her. But she wanted more. I remember reading where she said later when she had the opportunity to learn, she said she soaked up learning like a dry sponge would soak up water. And I thought, that's a pretty graphic picture. She persisted. I don't know how to say this except to say it. This little girl is the orphan child. She is growing up in a time when she was on the grace and favor of extended relatives, on their mercy. I don't know that it was true for all of those children, but it was true for her, and it was true for my grandmother, who experienced the same thing a few years later than Ida. Stories my grandmother told me and that Ida related, I see similarities. Some of those children were sort of expected to work for their keep.
Well, sure.
Absolutely. Ida told her when she was very young, she was expected to do all the baking in that family, and she had better do it right or there would be punishment. So she didn't have a privileged world. Despite that, she persevered and she graduated high school in 1880. Extraordinary, because few men had high school diplomas in 1880 and fewer women had them. She got hers, and when she did, she stepped out on her own. And she taught school for 2 years in a little country school in Limestone, Virginia. Back then, if you had a high school diploma, you were better educated than 90% of the people in the county and certainly qualified to teach those young children. She taught for 2 years and she turned 21. She had to be 21 for it to happen. When she turned 21, she came into a $1,000 inheritance from her grandfather who had died, her father's father. Now, back, it doesn't sound like much money, but in today's money it was over $20,000. For the first time in her difficult, struggling world, she has money. She writes to her brother, when she has 7. All but one have moved to Kansas. So this is how Kansas, and there's a picture for Ida. She writes to her brother, who is a minister, and he and his family live in a little town called Compton, Kansas, just west of Kansas City. There's a little college there, Lane College. And in her letter, she has the money. She said, could I come and live with you and your family and go to college? And he said, yes, you can. And to Kansas she went. And this picture, you will see it in the visitor center, is a photo that was taken of the ladies that were in the music class at Lane College. There happened to be all ladies in that class. Seated right here on the front row at the very end where I'm pointing is Miss Ida Stover. She's just enrolled there. I must tell you, I look at that picture and I think the day that that photographer took that picture, in Ida's most wondrous dreams, with the difficult life that child had had, she could not imagine what is ahead of her. She is going to become the mother of a president of the United States of America, and I think one of the finest men this country has ever produced. But she sure was. It was at Lane College where she met a young man, and he is pictured here, David Eisenhower. Now, the Eisenhowers originally came from Pennsylvania, and they had been prosperous farmers there. They belonged to a religious group much like the Mennonite and Amish communities. They were called River Brethren. Now, they were called that because the entire community of them lived right along the Susquehanna River. That's how they got the name, the River Brethren. They did well, but they heard about Kansas. So here comes Kansas for the Eisenhower family and that group of people. They heard there was vast acres out there, rich, fertile farmland, and it was untilled. And in Kansas, it was selling for $7.50 an acre. In Pennsylvania, the same acreage, $175 an acre. Big difference. So they checked it out, found it was true. That group of people decided they were going to sell those prosperous farms for very good money, keep their individual profit, but as a community in a caravan, they were all going west to Kansas, and in the same general region of Kansas, go out and buy a whole lot more land for a lot less money, and with hard work repeat their success. And they did just that. Today, you can go to that part, Navarre County and that region south of Abilene, right through there, and you still see the footprints of that generation of people who built that part of Kansas. The old River Brethren churches and the cemeteries are filled with those people who built their lives out there and built that country. Well, Jacob Eisenhower was the father of David. He had 6 children, including David, and he did so well in Kansas that when each of those children married, he was able to give each couple for a wedding gift. This is 1885 money, $2,000 cash, which is the equivalent of 40 to 50 in today's money, plus 160 acres of rich, fertile Kansas farmland free and clear, times 6. That's a fortune. David is at Lane College studying business courses. He doesn't want to be a farmer. You know, sometimes sons honestly don't want to do what the father did. He still got his portion of the inheritance. So David and Ida were married, and then David has a business opportunity. That's what he's wanting, a good business start in life. And to get into it, he has to have money. You know, it usually takes money to go into business. To get the cash, David mortgages the 160 acres, takes all the cash he can get together, and he goes into a business venture with another man in Hope, Kansas. Hope is about 20 miles south of Abilene. It was a general store. His money built the store in Hope, Kansas, and stocked the merchandise. After about 3 years, there were a variety of circumstances, some far beyond his control, that he couldn't do anything about, and there's business failure. Now, by this time, Ida has had their first child, and she's expecting the second. They had him about every 2 years. David has a growing family, and that man needed work. And it was that need for work that brought him right here to Denison, Texas. The town is area. The area is booming because of the railroad. Lots of jobs for men. He came here in the fall of 1888, took a room and board on this street that runs east and west right here. I could throw a rock and hit where the old house was. Lots of room and board facilities in railroad towns because he gave the homeowner a little money and the men needed a place to stay. Ida was approaching the third trimester of pregnancy with that second child, and it really would have been dangerous to come. There's no hospitals. They have no family, no friends, no place to live. He's in a room and board. She stayed with his people in Hope, Kansas until she had the baby 3 months later. By that time, David had found this little house close to where he worked, and he wrote to her and said, "Come on when you can, Ida, I have a place for us." She said she was never so scared in her life. You have to realize that in the 1870s and 80s and those 1800s, few women rode those trains by themselves. They were robbed. There were rough characters. The old westerns are quite right that rode those trains. She said she was standing up there on that platform in Abilene, long dress, of course, little 2-year-old holding on to her skirts, scared to death, and she's got the newborn baby in her arms. But I think there was a lot of steel in that little woman. And I think it was forged when she was 4.5 and 5 and her mother was dying and she faced that hard childhood. It made Ida strong. She got on that train, and it wasn't like getting on a jet today and flying to LA. You know, unless you slug a stewardess or refuse to do what they tell you to do, you don't have too much trouble. To begin with, this is before Pampers. This is before baby food, before formula, no food service, no air conditioning on that train. And how long she would have been on that train. I got the old time frame out to see how long. Close, right at 24 hours. She had to come through Indian Territory. A young nursing mother with little privacy by herself. That had to be hard. She pulls into Denison, and I said, to me, that's 24 hours without sleep, because I don't know a mother anywhere that would sleep under those conditions with that baby and that little 2-year-old. She would have been protecting those children. They pull in here, and she and David face the 3 hardest years, I'm convinced, of their almost 60 years of marriage right here in Denison, Texas. Think about it. They have had to really step down. They were store owners in Kansas, and now they're living on virtually a poverty-level income. Financially and psychologically, that had to be hard. But they pull it together. That little couple lived together 57 years. They moved back to Abilene, Kansas after 3 years in Texas, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. And David died in 1942. Ida passed away in 1946. They're all buried right there in Abilene. She especially lived long enough to see the little baby born right there in that room become arguably the most famous general in the world. And she lived to see him become a national hero. But she never lived to see her little son become president of the United States. But it's worth noting that he came to be a part of this family during the hardest, most difficult, struggling years of that little family's history. You know, William Wordsworth, the writer, made a statement, "The child is father to the man." I think there's much wisdom in that. We have a saying today, as the twig is bent. Well, they're saying the same thing. Tell a person about that childhood, about the beginnings and what they lived through, and you begin to see some imprint of what you're going to have as a man or a woman. I think there's much truth to that. He was born during a difficult, struggling time, but it helped to make Dwight Eisenhower the strong man that he became, too. Now, if you come into this next room, you're You're going to see a room that you're going to see on the video when you get back to the Visitor Center.
Okay, you have to get up there.
Let's come right in. Get back to the little video. Just a second, I'll be right with you right there. Just not there.
Okay.
I'll be right back there. I'm going to open this door for you. Where that thing. When you get back to the Visitor Center, you're going to see this room in the video in 1946. You're going to see General Eisenhower seated just about where you're standing, and you're going to see a little lady named Jenny Jackson. So let me tell you what happened, what makes it so special, as to how the house came to be preserved. In 1890, when President Eisenhower was born, Ida had made a friend. Her friend's name, Jenny Jackson. Jenny was a school teacher, single lady. She lived with her parents 1 block down that street. Well, Ida had been a school teacher, so the women had some things in common. When President Eisenhower was 10 days old, Jenny Jackson held him in this little house and rocked him. Well, 50-odd years passed. 50-odd years. The Eisenhowers long since, because they were gone after 3 years back, because Miss Jenny, she's buried here in Denison. She taught school here, she became a principal, she grew old, she retired. 1940s rolled around, she's 80 years old, and World War II was raging. Every day on the radio and in the newspaper, she was hearing and seeing that name, General Dwight David Eisenhower, which isn't a common name. And then she heard he was born in Denison, Texas. And I said, it must have hit her like a ton of bricks. Was that the baby Dwight that she had held and rocked in that struggling little home by those railroad tracks 50-odd years before? She writes to General Eisenhower asking that question. And busy man that he was, he responded to her letter. And it was from that Jenny Jackson, in her 80s, spearheaded the drive in this town. I mean, people began to donate money. School children took up collections, nickels, pennies, and dimes, and wealthy people gave quite a bit. And the city of Denison bought this little house and the little lot that it sits on. And in 1946, in April, they're going to have the dedication day of the birthplace of General Dwight David Eisenhower. He's not even president yet. Now, in 1946, he's back from Europe. The war has ended in Europe. He's serving as Chief of Staff, United States Army in Washington, D.C. Big job. Let me tell you, this is the biggest thing that had ever happened to Denison, Texas. Before or since, I've seen figures up to 25,000 people who descended upon this town, more than the population is today. But you have to realize, it's right at the end of the war. He's a national hero, and the country loved him. Reporters from around the world came, newspaper, radio announcers. Miss Jenny wrote him again because they corresponded several times. She said, I'm going to prepare. She helped prepare it right here in this dining room, a big breakfast that was going to be served for the dignitaries. Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, the mayor, all those people. And she said, would you like to attend? And he said he would be honored to attend. She asked him what he wanted for breakfast, and Mr. Eisenhower said, I don't care. He said, as long as there's a lot of hot coffee. He liked hot coffee. He flew into Perrin Air Force Base over here, pulled up out front, and let me tell you, downtown, he spoke in Forest Park. It was filled to overflowing with people. Parades down Main Street, flags were flying, people were hanging out of the buildings. Out here, they were in the streets, spilling over into the yards. He pulled up out front in those military cars, and he had an entourage, because Chief of Staff, United States Army has an entourage. Military police were lining that sidewalk out there, and man, they snapped to attention when he got out of that car. He walked down that sidewalk in the front, came up on that front porch, and was greeted. Then he stepped into that little parlor, and standing right there in the parlor with a great big breakfast prepared in the room behind her is little 80-some-odd-year-old Jenny Jackson, the lady who held him when he was 10 days old. Now, he's seeing her for the first time, but he knew she had been a good friend to his little mother 50-odd years before, when his mother needed a good friend. And Mr. Eisenhower walked over to her. He embraced her, and he said, so this is Miss Jenny. And Miss Jenny kissed him on the cheek and said, hello, Dwight. She called him Dwight. The world called him Ike. Even Mamie called him Ike, but not his mother. She didn't like nicknames, so it was Dwight. In fact, Ida would preface all of her sons and her husband's name with my David, my Dwight. And to me, I said, I think there's something beautiful about that moment. It's like the cycle of life flowing around. I said, that woman held that little baby in this struggling little home, and 50 odd years, she must have wondered, what are his chances in life? What opportunities? And 50 odd years later, we have a giant of a man coming through that door who has done so much for this world. And he's not even our president yet. He's going to do more as our president. I think had it not been for Miss Jenny, I doubt we would even have the house preserved today. You'd look at the rest of the neighborhood and see what happens. You know, everything just goes into decay. Now, what you'll see on that video, and you're right where it took place, Mr. Eisenhower's right there, his dignitaries, right here at the head of the table, you'll see a little silver-haired lady, and Sam Rayburn seated right over here to the left. That is Miss Jenny Jackson. You're going to see it in the video, and you're right where it happened. Mr. Eisenhower always felt like home was Abilene, Kansas, and that's so right, because that's where he grew up. And where we grow up, that's home. That's where our memories and our hearts are. But we have the privilege of saying he was born right here. We had him for 18 months, and then I said, thank God this world had him when we needed him later, and we did. Now, we don't go up the stairs. Those are narrow and steep. Wow. And the two oldest little, and we have 11 to 14,000 visitors a year, and I don't think they could hold up to that, really. The two oldest little boys had a room on that side, and upstairs on the north side, they let a room to a room and boarder, a Mr. Redmond. He worked for the railroad. Mr. Eisenhower knew him, and it helped him with their expenses, and he gave him a place to stay for a while.
Has that been restored up there too?
There are just two little bedrooms up there. We use it for storage for the archives now, things for the house and all.
Sure.
But he has a little claim to fame, of which he was most proud. Mr. Redmond said the night the president was born, there was a terrible, terrible storm that was raging when that child came into this world. A terrible storm. Ida even pondered it later. She said she was, of her religionist faith, she believed that sometimes there were like signs and omens that might portend things in the future. And Ida said she later contemplated that terrible storm that was raging when she was giving birth to that baby. She said she found herself wondering, might that mean that there might be violence in his life? I had to put the book down and pause. I thought, when you consider the fact that 50 odd years later, that little baby grew up to be the man who led the largest, most complex military expedition in the history of the world. There's never been anything like it. He sure did have to deal with it in a way few men do, but it certainly gave me pause when I was reading what his mother was thinking. Now, trains were still going up and down the track out here. And when they heard that General Eisenhower was born in this little house and that his father worked for the railroad, every time a train went by during the 40s, the engineer would hit that whistle to scream a salute to General Eisenhower and the troops. And I said, I'll bet it drove the neighbors crazy. Mr. Redmond, he came in out of that storm that night, saw some ladies from the neighborhood had come in to be with Mrs. Eisenhower. Mr. Eisenhower was here, and he said, I realized the Eisenhower's baby was going to be born very quickly. And he said, I didn't want Mr. Eisenhower to have to leave her. He said, I was the only other man anywhere around. So he volunteered to go get Dr. Bailey. He took off walking through that terrible storm, went downtown to 406 West Main, where Dr. Bailey's office was, got Dr. Bailey. Dr. Bailey came back in a horse and buggy that night, and that storm pulled up and was here to care for Mrs. Eisenhower and the baby. Mr. Redmond said, I had no idea what that little baby was going to become the night I ran for that doctor. And then we'll see the kitchen and let you go out. It'll be easier for you. We'll have to try to maneuver through it.
Okay.
About 3 years after they were here, the grandfather who had given them the inheritance came down to visit, saw how they were struggling and how much they missed the family and family missed them. River Brethren had done so well in Kansas. They had so much milk and butter and cream. They had opened a dairy called the Bell Springs Creamery. And progress came to town, and they were building a new Bell Springs Creamery with refrigeration. They could have ice cream. And with refrigerated train cars, you could have shipping. You could have a wonderful business. The grandfather had connection because he had been a minister for that group, and he had a relative who worked in a very high position there. So he asked David, the father, he said, David, would you like to bring your little family, come back to Abilene, and be the new engineer at the new Bell Springs Creamery? David said yes, but he doesn't have the training. You know, today people are so almost elitist about computers and online classes. How could anyone learn anything without it? Well, I said, I hate to burst bubbles, but the truth is there was distance learning long before computers were ever heard of. We called it correspondence schools. David took a correspondence course. People are just floored when you tell them that sometimes, the younger generation. He took a correspondence course from a school in Pennsylvania in refrigeration, got his certification, moved that little family back to Abilene, and he worked for the Bell Springs Creamery for years and years. Life was better for them. He and Ida lived the rest of the days of their life, and all of the kids grew up there. They had their own home, they had an acreage, they had a barn, they had animals, good place to grow up. She eventually had 7 sons. Remember, she had 7 brothers? That woman had 7 sons. She never had a daughter, always wanted one, never had one. One of her sons, little Paul, died when he was about 9 months old with diphtheria, but the other 6 boys grew to manhood. David, the father, was a decent man, hardworking. I think he was a very harsh father, from what I've read. I think he was. I would call him that. But he never made the kind of money to where he could send all those kids to college or underwrite them in a business as he had done for him. And I think further it probably was a regret of his life that he couldn't, but he couldn't. I think those boys knew that if they were to have anything in this world, they had to get out there and make it themselves, because nobody was going to give it to them. And did they ever? All 6 of them. And the diversity, it's remarkable. The oldest son became a banker, executive vice president for the Commerce Trust Company of Kansas, and a member of the Kansas City Board of Trade. Second oldest became an attorney, had his own law firm up in Washington State, and became very wealthy. Of all the Eisenhowers, Edgar was the one who had serious money. Dwight David Eisenhower, the third one, we know what that man became. I just love him. I have since I was a little kid, first knew about him. And I will tell you, it's an understatement. I think he's one of the finest public servants this country has ever been privileged to have, both as our general and then later as our president. I just love the man. And a little insight into his character. He was a young man just out of high school. He had no opportunities. He had to get a job. You know, where do you get a job in the middle of the Kansas plains? Wherever you can. He worked in those hot wheat fields. He went to work at night at the Bell Springs Creamery. Great big old 200-pound blocks of ice. He had to put the handlers on them, move that ice along those belt lines to make the refrigeration process work. With every penny from that salary that he could spare from what he was earning, he took it and sent it to that older brother, Edgar, who was away at college studying to become an attorney, the one who became so very wealthy. I think that says volumes about a young brother, that he would be that generous in spirit to do that. Then comes Roy. Roy became a pharmacist, opened his own pharmacies in Junction City, Kansas. There was Earl. He became an engineer, large utility company executive, also part owner of a radio station. And then the youngest, last but not least, came Milton Eisenhower. That's a name you may remember because yes. Milton lived the longest. Among the many things Milton did, Milton served as the president of 3 universities, including Johns Hopkins University. Something went right in the rearing of those kids. That family never had money, but they had standards, they had values, they had faith, they had respectable integrity, and they wanted those kids to go in the right direction, and they certainly did. And they had one terrific mother. I just love her. In the 1940s, when Dwight, she's very humble, she referred to Dwight's fame as when my son came to prominence. Now, Ida didn't like reporters. She wanted none of that. But reporters were always trying to interview her. So one day a reporter got hold of her in 1940 and said, Mrs. Eisenhower, he said, you must be very proud of your son, meaning Dwight. And she said, which son are you referring to? She said, I have 6, and I'm proud of all of them. And I said, what a good mother they had. Do you have any questions that I can answer before I let you through the kitchen?
I don't know, but you have a wealth of information.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
amazing. I just.
Well, I hope you've learned more about Mr. Eisenhower.
Oh, absolutely.
And the qualities and things that built him. It's a remarkable story, I think.
Oh,
Remarkable family. Now, the little kitchen, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, folks. So, it's pretty stark. Come right on in.
Go ahead, I'll follow you.
This stove is exactly the type she would have. It's cast iron, come right through. Cast iron, over, those things are on a million feet or whatever. The one you see over there, that's an 1890s dishwashing system inside. She would have bought her flour in 100-pound bags and baked, Milton said every day back in Kansas, every other day, so mother baked about 9 loaves of bread. So she had been cooking all the time. The little white building you see through the window there, that was where her chicken house was. And you see the garden space between there and this house, that's where she went as much as she and the oldest little boy can care for. Her clothesline pole was on the north side, right there by the kitchen window, close to the house. I said, smart lady, because over here she's got 14, 20 trains full of that white smoke.
Oh,
so
my
that
God.
house, right, would have sort of buffered her clothes. Now, if you come on to the porch, here, I'll show you where the well was. You see that floodlight out there in the garden? That's the tree trunk. If you walk a straight line from that floodlight to the corner of this porch, the leaves are all over it right now, but just about where the deepest pile of leaves are, right in there, there's an area, the ground is kind of sunken. It's about this big around, slightly sunken. That's where the well is located. About 10 years after they moved back to Kansas, the city of Denison put in water lines and sewer lines, and they had to fill in wells, otherwise children would have been drowned. Well, in 2007, we had the Texas Parks and Wildlife Company and underground surveillance, and they pinpointed that well. I told our site director, I said, if you ever have any extra money in the budget, think about building a little fake well house with a little wooden bucket.
Good idea.
And put a little plaque on it. On this site was the well that I used. And the old tree, well over 100 years old. Probably a little sapling when President Eisenhower was born. Every time we have a bad storm, I find myself thinking, oh, I hope nothing happens to that tree. It's kind of special. Well, it's been I'll see you back in the Visitor Center, and you're going to see the video. It's 7 minutes. It's worth every minute. And you will see General Eisenhower in that room right where you were.
Oh, okay.
So you were in history there.
Okay, thank you.
I'll see you back in a few moments.